The Pit of the Jungle. Einsvarde lifted his nose and sniffed the musty air. His keen senses cut through the foreign smells of the jungle and found water. The scent would be lost to most, but Einsvarde had honed his skills as a woodsman on the most inhospitable of regions. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and stood. This land, these Jungles of Churlok, was sweltering, and Einsvarde had been here for almost a week. In a recent excursion, he had happened upon a map that led him south to the jungle. The map grabbed him with the promise of exploration and the hint of treasure, and Einsvarde, as any man would be, was enticed. So he traveled south through the verdant Kelistar wilderness into the dark and wet Churlok. There were countless rumors regarding the jungle, but Einsvarde knew evil and monsters roamed all lands freely. Such was the way of the world. The map described the way to a great cavern hewn by water and time. The Kelistar told him of it, the pit of the jungle. The cavern was named Salandreth, but most who knew of it called it the Falls of Sorrow. Einsvarde did not care for ancient warnings or cautionary riddles. His will was strong, and it drove him to deeds of greatness, adventure, and danger, anything to hold back the dreaded dwindling of his mind. Einsvarde closed his eyes and called upon the elusive magics of the wild. He muttered a few ancient words taught to him by the Kelistar, and a vision came to his mind's eye. Like a star twinkling in darkness, he saw a light appear, which he knew to represent himself. Then, a short distance from his light, he saw a line of lights brighten. He opened his eyes, ending the spell, and glanced around the shadowy jungle to find the sun. It glowed green through the dense canopy. "Southeast," he muttered to himself, and began walking. For such a large and muscle-bound man, he seemed to glide through the forest and left no trace of his passing. One watching him might think him a brute by his appearance, but he walked lightly and chose each step with care. His long, graceful strides brought him quickly through the damp brush, and finally he came upon a small, pebble-bedded stream that flowed peacefully southward. Einsvarde muttered his thanks to his Kelistar teachers and their favored goddess, Seoan, the mother spirit. Wiping his brow once again, he strode along the bank of the stream, his senses alert for any threat from the shadows. A few days ago, on his 4th day in Churlok, a pair of jungle cats had nearly ambushed him, black yet hidden amongst the brush. The fighting was brief yet intense, and ended in one dying while its mate fled into the verdancy. There was a mighty bruise now blooming on Einsvarde's mailed chest. He smiled grimly at the memory. The thrill of the fight was still fresh, and it brought a renewed vigor to his spirit. An hour passed, and still he traversed the damp stream bank, moving soundlessly over stone and moss. The noises of the jungle seemed to suddenly, though not violently, grow louder. The air was filled with the sharp cries of brightly colored birds, the itching whines of rustling insects, and the whistling of the warm wind. But most importantly, Einsvarde could now hear the clear rushing of water. He quickened his pace, worried no longer about stealth and caution. A moment's jog brought him around a bend, and then he saw it. A great gouge in the earth lay before him. The stream he'd been following vomited its waters into its deep belly, as did countless other rivers and brooks. The hole was massive, hundreds of feet in diameter, and more hundreds deep. The water crashed over countless tiers of smooth, brown rock, and narrowed into one deep hole, where it all fell into blackness. The sound of the falls was tremendous, and the sight of it staggered him. Sunlight fell easily upon the colossal space, and though he knew the sight of it should cause him joy and awe, Einsvarde felt a growing unease. The claw of it grew within him, and as he fixed his furrowed gaze upon the deep, many-leveled hole across from him, a black blanket of terror flashed over his mind. It was gone in the same instant it appeared, but Einsvarde looked away. The flash was as a scream, and its echo haunted his mind. He shook his head, tussling his shaggy brown locks in a half-hearted attempt to push the fear from him. Now was not the time to be stricken. Einsvarde turned back to the gap and looked down into it. The flowing water rushed and frothed below, each stream and river crashing upon varying levels of slick stone. All of it flowed to that deep hole, and like the water, his mind was drawn back to it. Somewhere within his consciousness, it registered that this was both his destination and the birthplace of the Claw of Fear. He inhaled slowly, turned, and began the journey around the chasm to the opposite side, where he reckoned he'd find an easier way down. Einsvarde gave the fissure a wide berth, putting several dozen paces between the chasm and himself, though that did little to muffle the great uproar that issued from it. It took him nearly an hour to circumnavigate the gap, until finally he reached the thickest stream that fell into the deepest part of the great chasm. The water was from some mountain vein far to the east, and it rushed in thickly here. Einsvarde returned to the edge, where he found a series of footholds. For several long, straining minutes, he negotiated the slippery stones. The land around the hole was the highest point, giving him the most distance to climb down before reaching the bottom. Einsvarde climbed slowly until he stood, soaked to the core, on solid ground. He was on a large outcropping that jutted out from the wall of the gorge over the deep pit. The continuous flow of water rushed past him, a few feet from the edge. It emptied into the seemingly bottomless hole below him. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Einsvarde found that there was indeed a pool at its bottom. He could see the dark waves in the mist of the falls, but could see no way down. Well, he thought, there is one way down. Einsvarde uncorked a thin, wooden tube he carried at the small of his back. Almost as long as a dagger, the tube held within it a thin yet sturdy wand. The rod was surprisingly heavy for its size, and though its material was unknown to him, Einsvarde reckoned it to be made of stone. It was not pliable in the slightest, and was cold to the touch. He had found the wand in an old Dayloran crypt he had happened upon during a journey across the eyes of the world. The Daylorans had built many a burial site in those mountains in the days past, and this particular crypt housed the remains of a famed explorer. Affixus Lamarand, or Affixus the Strong as he was called, was buried with several artifacts used in his adventures. One, and perhaps the chief of these, was the wand. While Einsvarde nearly discarded the plain stone twig, he was glad he didn't, for after consulting a wizened lore-keeper in the capital, he found its uses were many. So many, in fact, that the lore-keeper claimed it would be nearly impossible to name them all. The lore-keeper, a scholar of legend and magic, was able to identify the wand by a simple yet powerful spell. Called the Branch of Thirol by its makers, who were Kelistar of an older time, it was perhaps the greatest tool an adventurer could ask for. All Einsvarde had learned from the lore-keeper was that it was made in Thirol, a small swath of land north of the great wilderness of Vorudel and south of the eyes of the world. Beyond that, and the knowledge of its seemingly endless uses, he needed to know little more. Yet, as he held it on the wet, precarious ledge overlooking the abyssal drop, he wished he had learned how to activate it. His experience with magic was limited, but he thought himself a resourceful enough man. He stepped to the edge of the outcropping. A few pebbles broke free of the overlook, and Einsvarde leapt back a step, watching as they plummeted into darkness, then, a moment later, splash into the pool below. He edged forward as curiosity urged him to look upon the chasm once more. He could feel some unearthly pull from within the pit, calling him to its extending depths. He stepped closer to the edge. Suddenly, the outcropping cracked beneath his feet and gave way. Einsvarde gasped as the immeasurable depth appeared beneath his feet and stretched its void mouth towards him. His grip on the branch tightened, and without warning, his movement ceased, though rock and loose stone continued to fall. Einsvarde looked to his feet and saw nothing below them save the great drop. He was floating in midair. Noticing the warmth of the branch in his hand, he laughed aloud. Being stuck here will do me no good, he thought, and his smile faded. But the next moment he found himself slowly descending into the chasm. It reacts to my very will, he thought. The walls of the cavern closed in around him, and though he could not see them, he felt their alien presence in his mind. The next moment, brilliant white light filled the room and illuminated the slick rock walls. He looked to the branch, which was now even warmer to the touch, but saw that the light did not emanate from it. Rather, it was him that seemed to glow like a torch. Einsvarde smiled again, mentally thanking the Kelistar rod. He continued to slowly float deeper into the gaping maw of darkness. The water poured fast and hard beside him, free-falling into the reaching pit. Slowly, the walls of the hole began to open in front and to his sides, until they stretched far beyond seeing into the gloom. Finally, he drifted down to float just above the inky pool, into which the water from above fell in. Mentally urging the branch to push him further, he floated out along the surface towards a bit of rock beyond the rushing water. He passed under the flow and was instantly drenched. Passing beyond the wall of water, the rest of the cavern was revealed to him. The white light of the branch shone upon the smooth black stone of the cave walls, and unveiled a stream leading from the pool into the gloom. Once Einsvarde's feet touched the stone, he was off, following the stream deeper into the caves. Along its stony bank, Einsvarde followed the stream as it cut through the open cavern. He glanced back. The light from above seemed lessened at this distance, as though some tangible shadow hung about the air. A wave of cold air washed over him, a breath from somewhere deeper in Salandreth. He turned back to look down the stream and saw the wall of the cavern, which was hidden before him in shadow and distance. The stream ran into a large opening and wound beyond the light of the branch. Einsvarde gripped the stone rod tightly and continued along the edge of the stream into the opening of the cave. Einsvarde realized as he walked lightly along the edge that despite the speed at which the water rushed, not a drop splashed about the sides. Almost like oil, the water flowed seamlessly through the bends and curves of the cave. Onward he followed the rushing water, around its hooks and turns, deeper and deeper into the blackness. Far removed from the free-flowing air above, Einsvarde could sense in his mind the crushing weight of countless layers of rock and stone above him. But there was something else he sensed, too. Something foreign and malignant, sentient and waiting. He pushed himself forward, driven by his desire to know, urged by gnawing fear of the dwindling. After a sharp curve, a giant flat wall of black stone appeared suddenly before him. Over 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide, the great obsidian slab was polished and carved to perfection. The water rushed by, hardly making a sound, but Einsvarde stood stock still, paralyzed by the sudden appearance of so menacing a thing. He did not know it, but he stood under the gaze of the gate of Salandreth. It was the true master of the cavern, and from it emanated the fear and malice. Built by the Eldred, eons ago, the door was a monument to their craftsmanship and their prehistoric cunning. In it they placed their vile desires and primeval secrets, which now beat before Einsvarde like a living thing. Tendrils of cold fear stretched out towards him, and panic took him. The light of the branch diminished, and Einsvarde, seized by the bolt of malignance, threw himself at the door. With both hands tight around the branch, he hammered it against the obsidian. When the branch connected with stone, a bloody light flashed out in the cave, and Einsvarde was thrown back. An image flashed in his mind, and his grip on the branch loosened. He was thrown into darkness. In his mind's eye, he saw a bright blade pierce an Icarus' beating heart. He saw it only for a moment, and then it was gone in a flash. His fingers stretched out in the darkness for the branch, which lay smoldering like an ember. When he touched it, the light returned, and taking it, he rose to his feet. The gate of Salandreth had been splintered and cracked by the mysterious blast from the branch. Massive cracks ran along its smooth surface, arcing out like a web from the point of impact. As he stood, Einsvarde realized he no longer felt the foreign hatred that once filled the cave. Moving to the door once again, he ran his hands along the cracked obsidian. When he found a suitable spot, he pushed hard against the stone. Slowly, with a rough grinding sound, a fragment of the door gave in and fell out the back of the door. He repeated this with another piece, and then another, until he had enough space to fit himself through. Branch in hand, Einsvarde squeezed himself through and out the other side. Beyond the gate, it was dark. The walls of the cave tapered after the door to a corridor that led downwards into the earth. Einsvarde noticed that these walls seemed worked, hewn by crude yet knowing hands. It was noticeably colder in the tunnel, and there hung about the air the scent of blood. He gripped the branch and descended into the corridor. For what felt like hours, he walked the corridor until he came upon another doorway. This one was smaller than the gate, almost too small to comfortably fit through, and there was no door. Sensing no immediate danger, Einsvarde moved to the doorway and squeezed himself through. Casting the light of the branch about, he looked upon the small room filled with rows and rows of small stone pedestals. He moved into the room and began to investigate the collection of small items on each pedestal. Combs of bone and bronze were common among the pedestals, as were crude weapons and long-fingered hooks. Einsvarde found many carven wooden figures and wrapped linen bundles stained with brown splotches. These things all seemed rather mundane to him, though he was not disappointed by the lack of treasure. He found a small, intricate mace of gold and black stone that he stuck into his belt, and continued along the row of pedestals. As he neared the middle of the room, a little breeze wafted over him, sending a dagger of chill down his spine. He stood, focusing his hearing. He scolded himself mentally for his inattention. Never once did he think that some creature might dwell among the items of this vault. Another breath toyed with his hair. Hearing nothing, he moved his free hand slowly to the arming sword at his belt, and in one swift motion turned and drew it. Before him was only the way he had come, devoid of life. Nothing moved or shifted. No creature ran at him from beyond the light. Again he felt his hair moved in a subtle wind. He turned again to see nothing. Slowly he looked up, aiming the light into the ceiling some 10 feet above him. A large, gaping hole, rough and unworked, smiled at him from the stone ceiling. He felt the air gust down and shake his clothing and hair. He sighed and sheathed his sword, releasing his fear for the moment. Then he called upon the power of the branch and rose slowly from the ground. It grew hot in his hand once more as he levitated towards the shaft. Einsvarde smiled, excited to know that there was some place new to explore. 2 lidless eyes focused on him as he rose towards the hole. Unknown to him, there was a creature that dwelled in the vault, and it felt its presence. The Eldred crafted it in a time long before man, their keeper of the vault. It was born from dark ritual and fueled by great sacrifice. The Galgamog, they named it, and its duty was to watch and tend the dead. It looked on Einsvarde, an outsider and an unworthy, and for the first time in countless millennia, it moved. Einsvarde was at the mouth of the shaft when he heard it. A series of sharp snaps and cracks, like the breaking of a bundle of bone-dried twigs, resonated throughout the vault. He paused and threw his gaze out over the room, but saw nothing. He turned back and urged the branch to push him further into the shaft. He found hand and footholds and began to climb. The shaft was tight and made for slow but steady progress. Einsvarde, while not an excellent climber, was proficient enough to move through the narrow parts without panicking. After a while, for the shaft was long and he could not see the end, his arms and legs began to work as one. Once or twice he paused, having thought he heard the slap of a hand on stone below him. Merely an echo of me, he told himself, and continued his climb. The shaft became tighter, and he struggled to squeeze through. After a few moments of grunting and pushing, he emerged from the shaft into a huge open chamber. All around him were stone altars, on top of which lay long shapes wrapped in yellowed linen. Bodies, all embalmed eons before man walked the world. The entire chamber was still and quiet, and a single shaft of light shone down from a hole in the ceiling. There was no need for the branch here, as the light illuminated much of the chamber, so he stuffed it in his belt. The beam fell on a single pedestal, which held something that glittered gold. Einsvarde walked slowly over to it, and, looking up, he saw that the tunnel above led to the surface, bringing the musk and light of the jungle down into the cool cavern. Looking back to the pedestal, he saw what lay upon it. Dog, cat, alligator, man. Teeth from all different animals, each dipped in gold and strung together on a long chain. Einsvarde lifted it from the pedestal and held it in the light. Almost human, he thought, looking at the molars. Not quite human. Almost imperceptible to the human ear, there came a small rasp from the shaft leading to the vault. Einsvarde turned, a hand already at the grip of his sword. There came another rasp. His weapon now drawn, Einsvarde advanced slowly towards the vault shaft. After another rasp, there was silence. Einsvarde drew alongside the hole, gazing into its depths. Only shadow met his eyes, and he breathed a sigh of relief. Then suddenly, a nightmare burst from the darkness. Einsvarde was knocked back. When he looked at it, he felt his breath leave his body. Rows of arms, human arms, lined a long, fleshy thorax. The hands were thin and dirty, some fingers bare to the bone from dragging on stone, some ending in long, yellowed nails. A large mouth clacked and slathered, flanked by 2 undulating eye spots. Joints creaked from thousands of dormant years, sending a shiver up his spine. Einsvarde rolled quickly to his feet, his sword now shaking in his hands. The Galgamog hissed and swung forward to attack. A reaching wall of flexing hands stretched towards Einsvarde, and he swung out with his sword instinctively. It bit into the hands, but drew no blood. The Galgamog spat at him, then continued its advance, rolling over onto another side, revealing fresh, tensing fingers. Einsvarde parried the thrusting arms as best he could, retreating under the constant barrage until his back knocked against the pedestal where the necklace had lain. In the beam of light, the Galgamog faltered, its eyes unused to the sun. Einsvarde leapt atop the pedestal gingerly, then aimed a great kick at the creature. The blow connected and knocked its bulk away from him. Without a moment's hesitation, he whipped the branch from his belt with the hand that still held the necklace and began to levitate. The Galgamog recovered quickly and, seeing its foe escaping into the horrible sunlight, reared itself onto the arms along its back half. The front arms flailed about wildly, searching hungrily for any piece of Einsvarde they could reach. The legs supporting it brought it onto the pedestal, giving it another few feet of range. Just as Einsvarde reached the mouth of the shaft, a strong hand grasped his ankle. He gasped in fear and pulled himself up into the rocky shaft, but the Galgamog came with, always reaching and stretching towards him. He wedged himself in the shaft and swung out with his weapon, cutting into a hand. Suddenly, the creature lunged upward, bringing its clacking mouth closer. Einsvarde stomped down hard before it could latch onto his foot. The heavy blow knocked the creature off balance, and it began to teeter on the few limbs left holding it. Einsvarde kicked out again, and the Galgamog began to fall, but not before clawing Einsvarde as it did. The monster's strength was immense, and even the poorly aimed slap knocked him free of his handholds. In a rush of panic, he gripped hard on the rough walls and the stone shaft, and watched in dismay as his sword and the branch of Thyrol fell to clatter at the feet of the monster below him. Necklace gripped hard in his hand, he began to climb with as much speed as he could muster. He could dimly hear the creaking hisses of the Galgamog below. Hand over hand he pulled himself over the cold walls of the stone towards the heat and sweat of the jungle above. The heart-stopping fear pushed his body to new limits, and he climbed on instinct alone. At last he emerged from the shaft and fell panting to the floor. The sunlight fell through the swaying trees as though oblivious to the horror that lay below them. Einsvarde felt a sharp pain in his hand. Looking to it, he saw that the necklace of golden teeth was marked with his blood. Salandreth had bitten.